The Georgia Bulldogs reminded us why they're the best team in college football, or at least in the conversation. I think that they are the best after what we saw against Tennessee, a team that many overhyped coming into this weekend matchup. And I think that we saw exactly who is the real contender and who is not. But things are not completely over for Tennessee. It also makes for an interesting playoff conversation that we will dive into later. First, we're going to take a look at Tennessee and Georgia. You look at what Tennessee had coming into this weekend. A lot of people were, some prominent people too, were comparing Tennessee to the 2019 LSU team, which I made a video about that, comparing those two teams and looking at those comments. And to me, that was never the case. This wasn't a Tennessee team that was lighting people up and in the way that LSU did in 2019. It just wasn't a team. It was a very good team, a team that was scoring a lot of points, but it was a very one-dimensional team in terms of offense and defense, and a team that didn't have the talent level that LSU did at that time. So that's something that was kind of exposed in a way. And you look at what Georgia was able to do. Tennessee came into the year averaging 50 points a game, 550 yards a game. They were held to 289 yards and 13 points. This is a Georgia team that is very good at slowing people down. And yes, this is a Georgia team that has a ton of new players starting on defense, but this is still a group that's full of 4 and 5 star talent, full of guys that did play a lot last year, but maybe just weren't the starters. There's some young guys that are playing too that stepped up in a big way. And Tennessee really just got exposed. Hendon Hooker, a potential Heisman candidate for Tennessee, his Heisman race is essentially over. 23 of 33 for 195 yards, no touchdowns and a pick. You look at even his wide receivers. Jalen Hyatt was one of the hottest wide receivers, one of the hottest players in college football, 6 catches for 63 yards. Cedric Tillman, a guy who lit up Georgia last year, was held to just 7 catches for 68 yards. Hendon Hooker was also sacked 8 times. I think every time I looked up, Hendon Hooker was hitting the ground on crucial drives when they needed points. It seemed like he was getting sacked. They just did not have an answer for Georgia's defense. They didn't have a way to combat that. And like I tweeted out, Josh Heupel teams are always good for one absolute dud every single year. And unfortunately, this was that time. Now, I'm not saying that Georgia is without flaw because let's be honest, there are some things that they could do better, but this is a team that you can make an argument is the most complete team in the country. They have talent on offense. They have explosive playmakers on offense. Their defense is lights out, and that is a combination that is going to get them far. Now you look at Ohio State, Michigan, TCU. I think that those teams all have more serious flaws they really need to address. So right now, to me, Georgia is the best team. And when you look at what they did to Tennessee, this is a Tennessee team that I think everybody was excited for. Now, I don't think everybody was making the 2019 LSU comparisons, but this is a team that was putting up points and yards in a hurry. And you look at some of the players that stepped up big. Jalen Cardew, who's missed a lot of this season, was a nightmare for Tennessee to stop. In fact, he had a couple plays where, they were eye-popping plays, a reminder of how athletic he is and how explosive he is, whether that's power or speed. He has the ability to change the game. They were already coming into this game without Nolan Smith, and they also lost Robert Beal during the game as well. So they lost some veteran players that could have made life difficult. And that is something we'll keep an eye on going forward. But this is still a team with a ton of talent, and the preparation and depth that they've built up until this point is really what stood out, because even though Smith was out and Beal was hurt during the game, didn't feel like they lost a step. This Tennessee team struggled to move the ball. They struggled to put up points, and that is something that really stood out to me. The Tennessee passing game never really got going, and this is a group that is very difficult to stop because they spread you out, because they are so quick to get the ball out. And Georgia did a good job of disguising coverages and changing things up so that Hendon Hooker couldn't get the ball out quick, and they were good at keeping things in front of him. Jalen Hyatt never really got past them. There were some plays where they got past him, but pressure stepped up. And that's the big thing. Georgia is not a perfect team. They're going to get beat sometimes, and they certainly did. But when your secondary gets beat, what does your front seven do to step up? And really, it felt like whenever one side screwed up, the other side picked them up. So if a guy from Tennessee got beat or got deep and beat this Georgia secondary, you're looking at a front seven that was able to get in Hendon Hooker's face. They were able to get a hit on him, and that affected the throws. That was huge. You look at the other side of the ball, too. Tennessee's defense was the liability of this team. Now, I'm not saying they were horrible, but it wasn't a group that was good by any means. They were not a great group. Stetson Bennett wasn't elite, but he did enough to get the job done. You look at what he was able to do. He was a poised player that made throws when he needed to. Him and Lad McConkey led the way for the most part for this Georgia offense. And there were some missed opportunities, I will say that, but this is an offense that is doing its job. The defense is doing its part as well. And that's a dangerous group because they are working well together. And it's been really fun to see. I think that Georgia just plays so well as a unit on both sides of the ball. And that's a big thing for them. Now, when you look at the remaining schedules, we're looking at now we'll dive into kind of playoff hopes. We're talking about a few other teams as well. We'll start with the two teams that played in this game. Georgia's remaining schedule at Mississippi State, at Kentucky. Those could be two tough games, but I really like what Georgia is doing. And then Georgia Tech at the end of the year. I don't really see a problem with that. Tennessee. Now, if Tennessee wins out, I don't think they have the schedule if other teams win out to get into the college football playoff. They play Missouri, at South Carolina, and at Vanderbilt. Now, if you're telling me that there needs to be some chaos, however, if Georgia wins out, Tennessee is not playing in the SEC championship game, which means that they are an 11-1 team that does not have a division title, does not have a conference title, and that is going to be tough to beat, especially if you have other one-loss teams such as the Clemsons of the world, such as the USCs, the Oregons. Those teams only have one loss and they have a conference championship. Tennessee is most likely not getting in, which coming into the year, people were talking about, even coming into this weekend, people were talking about a potential college football playoff championship or playoff that included three SEC teams. And that's something that people were concerned about. Now, I think that you're going to be lucky to see one. And I think you're going to see Georgia. I think that's what's going to happen. Now, there's still multiple weeks left, and that is something that could make things interesting when you look at the playoff teams that are remaining in the hunt, if you will. Georgia is sitting at 9-0. Ohio State and Michigan both are undefeated, but they play each other, and one will not play for the Big Ten championship. They're most likely going to destroy whoever wins in the Big Ten West. So that is a team that is going to be undefeated coming into the college football playoff. Then you have the argument of the other team. So if whichever team doesn't win that game has the same thing as Tennessee, where you don't win your division, you don't win your conference. So that's going to be tough. And I think that it's going to come down to what do those schedules look like? Because Tennessee's only other win outside of Alabama, they just lost this weekend. That's a loss that's going to put their ranking down. Kentucky, if Kentucky loses to Georgia, then Tennessee really needs them to stay ranked. That's going to help their case over whoever is going to be the loser of the Michigan Ohio State game. So then you have two teams in because Big Ten champion and SEC champion. TCU is undefeated. That is one of the more rocky undefeated teams and probably the most rocky team if you're looking at undefeated teams. That is something to keep an eye on. Tennessee is still ranked 5th in the AP poll. We haven't seen the college football playoff rankings, so we'll see what happens there. Oregon is behind them at 8-1. Oregon wins the Pac-12. To me, Oregon is in over Tennessee with a Pac-12 championship at one loss. Two losses is where it gets interesting. LSU is 7-2. They just beat Alabama. They can still win the SEC championship. That's where things get hairy. That's where things get interesting is if LSU wins the SEC championship. USC has one loss. Same thing as Oregon. A one-loss Pac-12 champion USC Trojans gets in over a Tennessee team. Same thing with UCLA. Now, Alabama still technically can win the SEC. They can still make a run at the SEC championship. Things get interesting if they win out. Ole Miss has one loss. Clemson has one loss. There are so many things that if you're a Tennessee fan, you have some hope for the future because there's so many chaos scenarios that make this so interesting. It also gets into the people who are the stay-at-4 people. I think that if you get a few losses here or there in the next few weeks and you have a bunch of 1 and 2 loss teams, you're good luck explaining that. I think that's the other thing to keep an eye on. So Tennessee is not completely dead in the water. I think that there is still a chance, and it's better than chances we've seen for teams in the past, but things still need to happen. You look at 3 teams in the Pac-12 that have one loss. You look at Clemson, who's probably still going to win the ACC, given that this was not an ACC loss to Notre Dame. That's a non-conference loss. So that's something to keep an eye on. The SEC still has a chance, I think, to make that 2 or 3 team college football playoff happen. But they're going to need some help from other conferences. TCU is battle tested. They face adversity. They're coming back from behind every single time. And to me, that is something that is going to help them in the long run. I just don't think they can get behind by too much because that's going to hurt them. Ohio State, they had a rough weekend against Northwestern, but that is still one of the most explosive teams in college football. That is someone that is going to be tough to beat as well. And that's exactly why I think Georgia is still the best team. I think they're the most complete team and they're the toughest team to beat because you can't beat their defense very well. They're still just as good as they were last year, and the offense appears to be better as well. So this is a team that is very well rounded. They proved why Tennessee was overhyped. Tennessee was not the better team. They didn't deserve to be the number one team in the country. And I think that when you're looking at it, Georgia is the best team. There's still a chance for Tennessee to get in. Georgia's path is very clear, and there's still plenty of opportunity for chaos in the remainder of the 2022 season.